Namaskar and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology, debunking mythology. Sattology means science of truth or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means science or study of fake, lie, or imagination. Understand one thing that the Sattology is actually the science of truth, and we do a lot of work in proving the antiquity of Indian civilization, as mentioned in Ramayana and Mahabharata, because before that there was no proper historical documentation, and after that also there is no proper documentation, at least from the eastern point of view. From the western point of view, the Greeks created mythology, Romans created mythology, all the fake narrations. The emperor without clothes is a Greek aphorism, because Greeks always remove clothes from the statues. And and the Romans did after that, and after that Europeans did lot of mythology in the world, and that is being taught in the campuses as a fact. So I have very special guest today, and we are talking on something very interesting. And some of you may be aware that he's a doctor, he's a professor, and he's also a chartered accountant, which is CPA. He speaks on economics but talks on everything else. So let's welcome Ankit Shah.
Namaskar, sir.
Namaskar. So one interesting thing is coming up. It's like we are celebrating, everyone is celebrating in the West about winter solstice, and they're celebrating that. That's the ancient name of this festival. Now, and at the same time, the governments are busy in preparing for war. To protect what? I don't know. So what do you think is what is going to happen in the current scenario with these war clouds everywhere happening, and the government's preparing for war in Serbia, Tunisia, and Haiti? Already US invaded 2 weeks back, and now Russia and Ukraine is anyway going on. Russia and US, Ukraine.
A lot of wars that we have seen, Aditya ji, in the last 30 to 40 years, somehow related, directly or indirectly with the what I call as the dollar of war, the United States dollar, which has this reserve currency status. So we all know that since, the Bretton Woods Agreement, the United States dollar was imposed on the world as a reserve currency, the new reserve currency of the world, replacing the British pound. And since then, at least, until 1971, that President Nixon unpacked it from gold standard. Until then, there was something finite, so to speak, as an underlying asset which was backing the value of the US dollar, wherein, the people had this trust and faith on what that currency represents. Until then, that was the case. But after 1971 and 1973, we all know how Henry Kissinger went on to the Gulf, and with the oil for security program, wherein, the Gulf oil was to be sold only in the US dollar, the concept of petrodollar and fiat currency came into existence from that point in time. So last 30, 40 years, I mean, whatever that we are seeing brewing up in the world in terms of wars and conflicts have some direct or indirect connection with the US dollar, keeping the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world. Now, you need to understand what would be the benefit of keeping the US dollar as a reserve currency status in the world. So almost all the bilateral transactions between countries of the world, and even the multilateral transactions with the international busybodies, happen in US dollar, which means that the US single-handedly gains this privilege of printing endless amount of US dollars or electronic entries, whatever that you call it, of the currency. And because of that endless printing, all the social benefits, the retirement benefits, or the freebies, or you call the income insecurity, right? All of these, even the COVID checks in the last 3 to 4 years that were distributed, all this is possible only because of this, the reserve currency status which United States enjoys so much. So what has happened in the last this particular year specifically is that the Russia-Ukraine conflict, wherein, the United States went ahead and sized the Russian reserves in the US dollar, and that is how we are moving towards a world which is of de-dollarization. That's the real de-dollarization which is happening now, wherein the countries of the world are saying that our reserves are no more safe. I mean, United States has this privilege of single-handedly, just hijacking the reserves that the countries have generated over the years of their hard work of exports and all. So now the countries are realizing one by one that this is a very risky financial process to have, be it the SWIFT payment system or this process of keeping just one reserve currency in the world. So that is where the world is heading towards, a de-dollarization process, wherein obviously there would be some kind of responses expected from the United States factions as well. I mean, well, I could see some particular factions aligned to this goal because of the massive US debts, which are now have become unsolvable. But there are still some factions who would like to cling on to the reserve currency status. So it looks like the US deep states has a vertical split in this sense, and that is going to play out next year.
So just for the viewers, I can tell, and discretion is that Ankit and I don't have any access to anyone. We just go by the public information, and Ankit is more attuned to studying the trends, and therefore and also the public statements made by people. So we don't have any inside information. So but Ankit, whatever he has said has come true over the last 5, 6 years. So there's a clairvoyance attached to what he's saying. Ankit, like what what makes you feel that the deep state or invisible state? Because I am intrigued by the deep state because in technology world there was a deep data, deep analysis. The deep word was very mythological, and I could never fathom it in the deep state or a big data, like nothing big data. So what do you think? What do you point out? What you are pointing out that people within the US establishment may also be colluding with this decline? What do you mean by that?
So there are some factions in the, I mean, when we talk about the word deep state, we understand that when the baton of leadership got transferred to the other side of Atlantic from UK to the United States, it is it is very well understood that few aristocrat families attached to few corporate entities were had accumulation of power in terms of decision making in the United States, and which is where the origins of this deep state is rooted in. So when I say that some factions of the United States deep state is aligned to the de-dollarization process, I mean, it's all in the public forum. You can easily check out articles and research papers written by some of the officials who are right now in the Biden administration, who have written articles on with the titles like "Dethrone the King Dollar." So this is not something which is new. I mean, many in the administration are of the view that the fiat currency formula, which worked for 40, 50 years, is not going to be the way forward. And the simple reason for that is the fundamental assumption that the West will have this role of only financing uh, the real production and the physical assets which Asia and the Gulf produces and generates. I think that formulation itself was a very wrong formulation to begin economics with, which is why I believe some factions of the United States would agree on the de-dollarization process, because of the mountain of US debts that it has created in this journey of the last 40 to 50 years. It's totally unsolvable. I mean, every single problem that United States faced over the years, the only solution was go for the printing machine, just print more dollars. So I think the mountain is now so big that one faction of the United States deep state really believes that the fiat currency model should go, whereas there would be other faction which would be resisting this change which is coming, because this change is not going to be something which is comfortable to the majority of Americans, because it basically translates into a downgrade in the lifestyle that they have lived over the years.
So in the yesterday there was one tweet by the Spectator Index 2 days back or maybe one week back. It set the US debt at 115% of the GDP, and
Mhm.
which was alarming. And most of the people who read it must be the one thing unique characteristic which the West and especially US has developed is most of the people are very innocent. They don't care about what's going on. There is a hidden belief that our government will do anything to make sure our living standards don't go down. So, how far is that faith sustainable? It's like a blind faith that yes, there is a government and they will do something or the other, hook or crook. And they have been doing
So
so far successfully, hook or crook.
so, well, if you debate with any Americans who have an idea of what the reserve currency status is, what the privileges are, and when you debate with them that this kind of a change is something that is coming, the debate almost boils down to, hey, we have so many aircraft carriers. I mean, finally, we'll go for that. So, I mean, if that is the solution which they have faith in, uh, then let's see what happens next year. I mean, if United States really wanted to war with nuclear powers like Russia or China, I don't think that is something which is feasible without a catastrophe of of gigantic proportions. But in case if they are having a faith on some financial abracadabra or some gimmick, some financial gimmick, then that is very much possible in the sense that you start something which is a fiat currency model. You can certainly repeg dollar with the gold reserves that you have, and States still does have massive amount of gold reserves. So to repeg the dollar. So, but yes, in terms of the living standard, it will certainly go down from the current levels in terms of the freebies, the socialist freebies, the free market world is enjoying through this government, be it income security or the entitlements or the 401k or the retirement benefits, right? So these are not the this was possible because of the endless printing of dollar, which was possible because of the reserve currency status. Now it doesn't seem possible because if even if you go back to history, those countries which have attempted de-dollarization, we all know what happened with Saddam Hussein. uh, we all know what happened with Gaddafi, and they were trying to move out their trade from the US dollar denomination and invoicing, and the fate that they seen. So maybe the natives have this faith on the US military imposition, that they think that this time also we will sail through. But at this time, it's very different. It's not the same thing. Now there are around 30 plus nations who are intent on de-dollarization. I don't think this is stoppable with even with a war. It doesn't look like it's stoppable.
So one question comes to is that because the war is in everybody's mind, and unfortunately, the US government calls, you see, I see the standards of the US government are very high. So when they want to entertain themselves, they call another head of the state to entertain themselves as a stand-up comedian. And they did that recently. And they invited someone who is a professionally was a stand-up comedian. I know all of you know what I'm talking about. And they entertained themselves and also gave him a fat check of $1.8 billion. Will you
Mhm.
believe out of $1.7 trillion, $0.7 trillion is going to other countries from the US, and for God knows reasons, like countries like Pakistan, Tunisia, Ukraine, like Americans have nothing to do with them. Like it's just like the what happened in the British Empire, what happened in the Roman Empire. It's same getting repeated in the American Empire also, dollar-based empire. Now, one question is that how long will the American economy sustain this kind of expenditures?
So most of these expenditures, which are directed towards foreign nations, have a lot to do with what I call as preserving this reserve currency status. Now, one thing we need to understand that when the bilateral transactions between countries shift to outside dollar invoicing and referencing, what that means is that the demand for the dollar is going to go down over the years gradually. So what is going to happen with all the funding that the United States trying to do in several nations worldwide. It is somehow looks like, a kind of an escapism where they are going to throw dollars on this nation so that they are going to use it somewhere. It's kind of the last attempt at surviving some relevance of US dollar in the foreign trade, where this very small nations would be tempted to continue using the US dollar despite some major parts of the world moving towards de-dollarization. So it will not be a surprise if billions of dollars go into Africa, or some small nations, billions of dollars go outside, whereas there are homeless in America itself. I mean, it's just ironical that the U.S. government does not care about. There are a lot of issues to be addressed at home, and the funding is going somewhere outside, because the Americans do not realize that keeping this hegemony, or some relevance in the geopolitics, is very much important for the American lifestyle, which is currently ongoing. So these questions are natural, that why the money is going outside. Well, it indirectly helps keeping the lifestyle which is going on.
You're right. America is the biggest attractor of FDI, which is people buy the US dollar as a treasury, and then that's a thing. Now, America is a very urbanized society. 30% of all Americans live in urban centers. 30%. And amongst, I mean, 80% of Americans live in urban centers, and 30% of people living in the urban centers are below the American poverty line. That American poverty line is they can afford only one meal a day. And that is America. It may, so don't convert, people can start immediately converting dollars to rupees. That's not the way it works, because the cost is also high. So like
Correct.
$10 is one meal, generally 10 to
Correct.
$12 is one meal, and that is means they can afford only one meal. If you convert in other countries, I don't know which countries are watching, then you can see how much is in your currency, but that's not the reality, because the dollar's purchasing power is different here. Now, coming to the purchasing power parity, which is the model accepted by the CIA and world bodies to calculate the actual economic potential of any adversary from the American point of view. Now, if you look at that, then India is the third largest economy today, PPP, according to CIA. And its nominal GDP doesn't work. So when Indian government says $5 trillion economy, in American context, it means $20 trillion economy. Because they are calculating, like right now, Indian GDP is considered to be $11 trillion economy, according to Americans. So 21 to 22, which will be almost much higher than what it is today. So tell me, what will be because Americans view India as a friend all the time. There is a soft power of India where India is not considered a threat, because from the government side, they think they can manipulate India through their agencies. And from the people side of it, India is a land of yoga, mind, and educated people, doctors, engineers. This is what the common people think of Indians. And people who are generally very nice, not criminals. This is the general view of Indians. So but looking at India from an adversarial point of view, it will change everything in the US. So India's growth is considered positive in the USA so far. But agencies of America don't view that way. They work India as a potential adversary. 2047, there's a book published that 2047 will be the year in which US and India will clash militarily, economically, both. And the moral strength of US will go to India as a moral champion of democracy or Lokatantra. Lokatantra is different than democracy. So how do you view India's position today in the world vis-a-vis United States, and what will happen in the future?
So this India-America relation is something which is, something which is, goes up and down, up and down, up and down. But I remain very positive in terms of short-term, medium-term, and even long-term relationships between the two nations. As you rightly pointed out, some of the values and the ethos of both the population broadly match. I mean, if you are going to compare the value systems of what the Indian population and the American population, or compare that with the Russian or the Chinese style of governance, you can clearly see the mismatch that the India has in terms of with the socialist countries. So I remain very positive with the kind of relations, but I am little disappointed with the kind of governance that sits in Washington in terms of not measuring up with understanding how India is going to move forward in this world. Specifically, because I mean, if you just look at the position right now, we don't have a U.S. ambassador in India, in a country which you call as your strategic partner or ally or a future ally. You don't have a full-time ambassador for what? I mean, since the date of oath of Biden as the president, that is 2021 January. So you see, I mean, and then America as a country wants India to come along and play with the West in terms of taking stand against Russia in the Ukraine case and whatnot. Look at the kind of expectations which the American administration have. So India views itself not as an ally of United States, and I think it was good that a certain White House official clearly spelled that out in public, that yes, yeah, India is going to be a separate pole in the new multipolar world that is going to come up. But in terms of short to long term, especially when you're mentioning the purchasing power parity in dollar terms, we need to see that when the world is moving towards de-dollarization, mark my words very clearly, the West will need the West will need India by its side, and not just by its side, it will also need India's support to sail through these turbulent times when the fiat dollar formula falls flat on its face. So next year, when you see the formulations being very clear about the BRICS currency model, which will be of a packed commodities and packed real production formula, which will come up, that is a point in time for 2 to 3 years when West will really require India's help and assistance to sail through this storm which is coming, because there is no way a fiat currency can be accepted as payment if a big chunk of Asia and Gulf is shifting towards a currency which is a pegged currency with real production and commodities, which means that if you want to buy something with a US dollar, which is a fiat currency, I think it's going to be almost impossible to do the valuations or the invoicing or the referencing when you clearly see that the countries are planning making payment system outside of the SWIFT to get rid of the US dollar. I mean, the dollar is so much cursed now, wherein even the South American countries and even the African nations now believe that the dollar has been the cause of the massive inflation waves that they have faced year on year, every single time. And if you look at the case where 2008 crisis, just look at that crisis. After that, the United States started printing dollars from 2009 to 2011, and the effect of the endless printing which United States did to come out of, to bring Americans out of that economic crisis, that entire cost was passed on to the world as in terms of food and energy pricing inflation, because those were invoiced in the US dollar denomination. And several of the countries in the Gulf, their government just fell down, what we refer to as the Arab Spring, because of the food inflation. This was nothing but the cost of the American lifestyle from 2008 to 2011, that endless printing which brought down governments in the Middle East in the form of Arab Spring. So I think the realization has now been so clear and very strong with all the countries in the world that the dollar is causing uh, an endless harm, and that is why the world is moving towards no single country world reserve currency.
So oftentimes we when we study the world, and according to the American makers means USA, Canada, and Europe. That's the world. Everything else is not doesn't count as a world, whereas it's only around 700 million people, 800 million people. And that too, only the European species is considered American. Rest everybody, if they get stuck in outside airports or something happens, the American government won't respond. So they are on their own, by the way. So if you look at Africa point of view, have you studied that what, because Africa is the most, is a very rich continent and oftentimes the most ignored one, where the French still maintain colonies in Africa. The
Mhm.
French, if there are riots in the France, it's for a valid reason, because those people are frustrated from Ghana and Ivory Coast and other people, which are still completely controlled by the French, and colonization is still on over there. So Africa is usually ignored. And so how does Africa takes this process? Because African Union people, leaders are very vocal. They have said in the US, they've said in the, and they oftentimes speak in a very American accent, which is very funny also sometimes.
So, Africa as a continent will be the new battlefield for all the players in the world, all the big players in the world, especially when you see that the Gulf and Asia wants to move towards a currency which is a pegged currency. The African leaders are very strong. The people are ready to fight whatever the military onslaught it comes upon. But I believe that it's going to be a new battlefield in terms of not just trade and investments, but because of its massive natural resources as well. Because if you are going to have a currency in the world which is going to be a pegged currency to commodities and real production, what it means that the mining industry could be highly regulated moving forward and even nationalized in some countries, which means that Africa, which is a big treasure in terms of mining resources, definitely the eyes of all the global powers will be on how to tap those resources. So Africa will be the new battlefield, and also some of the African nations who want to come out of the colonial oppression which they have faced. And you rightly pointed out there's so many indirect French colonies, so to speak, with the direct and indirect influence of the French government. Similarly, there are colonies of US and UK as well, indirectly, in terms of, I mean, if I'm just to give you an example of how you make moves to make a country a colony kind of a thing. Assume there's a poor country which has a problem with the water resources. What do the so-called international community of nations, the West, which you talked about, US, UK, Europe, Canada, Australia, what do they do to help such a poor nation? They would sponsor supply of water bottles, right? That is what they would do, which means that next year again that poor nation would be requiring the same help, which means an onslaught of policy terms and conditions which is defined by the West for in lieu of in exchange of that water supply every year. Right now, we just compare that with what India would do. India would help them build dams, right, so that next year they do not have to come again for asking things. So you see, when this kind of nations, they are going to make uh, huge amount of exploitation with these African countries, and African countries will have to take some stand when it comes to picking who their partners would be, partners in development would be. So Russia, China, India, United States, that they have many options now, where the world goes in terms of the African world moves. I mean, South Africa is definitely a part of BRICS, a major part of BRICS organization. So, and they are keen to move towards moving out of the US dollar hegemony. Even small countries, Zimbabwe, Ghana, moving towards gold and silver kind of commodities to trade their major transactions. So new things happening, and we are watching United States military with a lot of surprise as to how they move about these new changes which are coming next year.
So we talked about Africa, and for viewers, I can tell you Ghana, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, these are very rich countries, minerally rich. And also the southern part of above South, people often talk about South Africa is the biggest economy in that continent, but the countries above that, they're all mineral rich countries, and they're untouched by most of the powers, even though colonization was not in place. And India has a very soft power, large soft power in all countries of Africa, and China is getting in also in a big way. So the in the Africa, one thing is there in the African continent is that their national pride is going up like anything in the original cultures. They're rejecting the Western influences and much more vocal about it than any of the other countries in the world, whether it's Asia, even including India. I mean, India has
True.
a long culture, but still African Union, the way they come up with is like they're speaking as one country, the whole continent, in many ways
Mhm.
now, all the leaders. So people don't like it in the West, especially the government side. American, as if I talk about the Americans in the small towns, I'm not talking about the cities, because cities are very polarized and cities have don't care. But the Americans who are thinkers generally are in the smaller towns and the interiors of the United States, and they
Mhm.
are completely opposite of what the people make out to be. They have long marriages, like you won't be surprised that minimum marriage is 25 to 30 years. They stand one partner only for rest of the life. So very cultured interior America. Now, according to them, they don't want America to go to any country for any war whatsoever. Opposite of that is the representatives in the Congress and other people who take money from the cities. They are completely lobbied by every other agency of the world or every other organization. China is the biggest player over there, and sometimes even European countries, especially British. And so there are two Americas here. One is uh, n- the small town America, and one is a big town America. Big town America talks about aircraft carriers and wars and other things. Small town America talks about get out of everywhere. Just let us live with our land, nothing else. So now these two contrast, and but the oftentimes the people who are the duck which quacks the loudest gets the cracker. That happens there. So how do you see South American countries where most of the Americans are shifting now, like in from California to Mexico, it was a record 1,000 plus families moved in 2022 alone. And and must this is the official record. The real on the ground will be 4 times or 5 times on the ground. And so South America is just absorbing the rich American crowd who is there to retire. They are not going to add anything economically, but just retire. And so, how does the world view Americans fleeing their own country, losing hope, and and still many people want to come to America, like especially from Middle East. And if you give an option to any Middle Eastern guy, he'll say America, and that's it
Mhm.
continuing. So how do you think the world will play, the de-dollarization will play when the dollar is again being used in South American countries?
So this particular question is very interesting, Aditya ji, because it has a macroeconomic background in all the nations. When you say the rural untouched America and the urban America, similarly we have rural untouched Bharat and the urbanized India. So all the countries have this two parallels which are moving around. And one of the common theme among the urban sections of all the countries is the US dollar. That's the common minimum denomination, which is, in general with all the urbanized section of all the countries in the world. And I'll tell you the exact reason for this. The United States dollar, in its, this fiat currency model, where it is not pegged to any real production and manufacturing or commodities. What that exactly means is that you gave birth to a service sector. Because of this fiat currency model, you created some unrequired jobs which probably do not add so much real value to the lives of the people, but you created a balloon of, glorifying those jobs and the massive pay scales that those jobs carry. And you not just did that in America, you actually exported that idea to the world. And in most countries, if you take the example of the Indian IT sector, now a lot of outsourcing work which comes from the West to the Indians over here, this basically, these are the, I would say, for, uh, for a lack of good word, a kind of dog biscuits which are thrown on the countries to keep the US dollar going. Because the four items which are oppressed in this world are manufacturing, farming, real production and commodities, gold and silver. These are the these are the 4 5 items which are artificially oppressed to keep the fiat currency model of the US dollar surviving for the last 50 years. So it is but natural that the rural, untouched America does not want wars. The rural Bharat relies on farming and actual production and actual commodities. The urbanized India is attracted to the Western urbanized American lifestyle, wherein the morals fall from the usual family unit traditional values which we call about. So I think de-dollarization will wipe out a lot many of unrequired service sector jobs, and will bring down them to the real value that they are. And it has a lot to do with what America does with its military. I mean, is it going to cut the defense budget once the US dollar gets repegged to some real commodity like gold or silver? So a lot of things are connected over here, as you see, countries to countries.
One thing is very clear that the trends are like the whole humanity trends are the same. There's the urban model has failed. Urban model is a combination of corporatization. One thing good about Africa and India and Asia generally is majority of their population is rural. So the
Mhm.
voice is also rural. Like the India has a 60% population is rural. And fortunately, it should stay that way because urbanization brings more poverty, and you know better than me. So in urban poor are worse than the rural poor. Rural poor at least have quality of life. Urban poor don't
Mhm.
have quality of life. Now,
Correct.
coming back to the question, the American model has forced urbanization in most of the countries of the world. And America has remained a constitutional republic in a way because they follow Aristotelian thought. Aristotle was against democracy, by the way, but Americans have exported democracy, which creates anarchy. And people know that Plato and Socrates were both killed because of democracy. And Socrates had to commit suicide, and not suicide; it was a forced suicide. He had to drink a poison, and what happened to Plato, his disciple, is also similar to that. So the the export of democracy in the de-dollarized aspect, how will that work? Because there's no incentive now.
Mhm.
Earlier, it was an incentive that if you overthrow the government, I'll give you a couple of, just like Imran Khan, when he was said, "Oh, my government is being thrown," he couldn't do anything against one American, Chinese American, Donald Liu, and he couldn't force anything. He had to go because he had to get the dollars, $50 million.
Uh, so yeah, so as soon as I read the first time that Saudi Arabia is keen to join the BRICS organization, and there will be energy which will be traded in domestic currencies of several countries, the first thought that came to my mind was, I think like some American sitting somewhere is thinking about imposing democracy in Saudi Arabia. So everybody understands that this kind of pretexts which are used to impose puppets over nations. And also, you know this is not just about America. I mean, the entire Western Abrahamic thought process with which the international busybodies are being built upon after the Second World War, be it United Nations, so be it, I mean, if you just open the United Nations human rights declarations and stuff like that, you will find the word democracy over there. Now, what is the evidence that democracy is the format which is the best format which should be imposed upon every country, and who has the right to impose it, by the way? That is a question to be answered. If I am to answer, I would certainly say that the autonomous Janapada structure of ancient Bharat was something which was really a very modern and advanced form of governance structure. But right now, what we are reduced into a democratic format, the fundamental assumption which belies this format is that every vote is going to be a rational vote. And you, me, and everyone knows that this fundamental assumption is so incorrect that every voter is going to vote rationally, right? So this is democracy is inherently suicidal in this sense that, if you're relying on crowds to be rationally voting without any influences, external influences, is something I do not believe to be a correct proposition, which is why I see in the future, when the European Union will face crusades again with some of the young radicals which are being imported into Europe. It is very obvious that starting from UK, there are going to be street clashes between the natives and the radicals, because these are very young radicals imported from the Middle East, who are radicalized by the clerics into blind acts of terrorism and whatnot, which the Europe will very soon witness. So I believe that will be the time when Europe will reinvent itself and revisit this democracy concept and the secularism concepts. And certainly, one of the transition which I foresee over the decades is that one family, one vote is something which is a natural outcome after the clashes and the chaos which this single person, single vote system will create in general in the future. So that is what one of the foretelling, if you say, I can do, is one family, one vote is something which Europe will come up with once it faces the repercussions of the democratic format.
See, the one very good answer, and I think viewers will see what we are explaining. Pure capitalism has failed, created a rich versus poor divide. Poor, and comes to your topic now, which is Sanatan economics, which is your topic. And by the way, viewers, he's writing a book. Do buy that book, and I'll also get that book. Uh, so capitalism has failed, communism has failed, extreme ideologies. Socialism has failed, created a again extreme ideology, and all the other isms are failing gradually because. And by the way, you should never call Hinduism, because Hinduism is a. If you call Hinduism, then call Christianism, Islamism, everything else Judaism. So, but ism means something mythological or man-made. By the way, all the people who don't call themselves ism are man-made, by the way. So all isms are failing. And but the old economy, old model of spending within your limits is still stands today. Common sense, like jitni chadar utna pair in Hindi, they say it, like means how much you can stretch your what do you call it, quilt or whatever. Anyway, English translation cannot do, but whatever is in a limit, spend that much.
Yeah.
So that is succeeding, and that is considered bad. Because in the debt economies like US, it is considered bad. And there are videos made by people like Kiyosaki and like Rich Man Poor Dad guys. Videos made by them that how I became a billionaire with debt. Debt is good. This is being sold. That is good. And
Yeah.
these people are called for every Oscar meeting, every Nobel Prize meeting, and everything else. They became good because they know how to milk the system, American system. And that has created billionaires. But the way the dollar economy crashes, they will be paupers on the street within an hour, because banks have to withdraw their money. They have to put somewhere else, maybe fund the US military, by the way. So they all have to do that. So how is a good debt model, or the debt model is based on spending, and the other model is the it means that everything belongs to the state, is also failing. So where does the middle ground. What is the middle ground then?
So, uh, as you know, my book is coming on the entire Sanatan economics, how ancient India operated successfully, until and unless there were, invasions by the brutal invaders that came in the entire modern setup, which was then targeted at that point in time. So, you need to understand that both Adam Smith and Karl Marx, where do they come from? I mean, this comes from the religious beliefs and the doctrine of one life concept. Now, when you believe that this is your only life, you are certainly have the stress and the anxiety to consume everything and win in this only life, which is why this endless spending model comes in the Western countries. And now, if you look at Adam Smith, when he talks about a free trade or a free market economy, I mean, there are massive gaps in that theory in the sense that he totally ignores the power of money, right? So when he says that it's going to be a free market, he is unable to mitigate that there could be a corporate giant who's going to eat away all the small fishes in the market, and that becomes the dominant player, and not just becomes dominant player, he can also now purchase the government, through funding the election campaigns, and one fine day that corporate giant may also define what human rights are for the people. So I mean, there are so many, big gaps in the theory of free market. I mean, if United States was such a big free market model, then why is it doing socialist freebies? Retirement benefits, entitlements, income security, Medicaid, right? So why are socialist freebies required in that case? And if China, which is a communist model, by the way, why is it earning money out of the exports free trade model, and also accumulating private wealth? Private wealth should not be in communism and socialism, right? So both the models are totally flawed. There are big gaps which need to be plugged in, and which is where I believe the ancient India Sanatan economics model will perfectly fit in. I believe that both Adam Smith and Karl Marx forget to mention the word family in their theories, which is where the problem lies. Capitalism and communism, if I'm supposed to define, I will say it is basically exporting the family sacrifices outside of the family unit, which is why it becomes brutal to whoever happens to become the victim of these both theories. So that is how I would conclude capitalism and socialism. It's just export of family sacrifices outside of the family unit. You thinking someone else is responsible for what you are facing today, and you want the government to suck wealth from that guy and give it to you, and which is where this fancy ideologies of equality of outcomes and equality of opportunities are derived from, which are all a forced kind of a system which are imposed on the people. I mean, the voters who believe that they can vote out freebies by becoming a vote bundle. And this is how the entire craziness has come about, with Adam Smith causing about 60% divorces in the world, with the hyper individualism and consumerism, and Karl Marx causing about 60% of slave population with state control. None of these are working, and which is why Sanatan economics has to come out as the only viable option, where you have dharmic cap on profits, and also you have sustenance and welfare, which is done in a way where the beneficiary does not become entitled and become a monster who's putting a gun on your head and sucking out freebies from your pocket, as and you are a genuine taxpayer who's working hard day and night. So there has to be a balance, and that is where Sanatan economics come into play.
See, the one very interesting thing is when Narad Muni talks to Yudhishthir, and he says to Yudhishthir, I'm not going to give you any knowledge on Arthashastra because you're already expert in that. But then he asks him a question: do you overtax your citizens? Do you have safeguards put in the place who may misuse the system and overtax them for any due to any corruption activities? And Yudhishthir says, no, I don't. I put all the checks. There is nobody can overcharge. So like the taxation was so minimal. Now in Bhagavad Puran, it says that people will run to the forest because the governments will turn into dakat. Dasu means they will become like a robbers. We are seeing that right now. We're seeing that with our own eyes. When I see many America, because America is a place where Kali Yuga comes first and worst form, which we are seeing now.
Correct.
The ancient Americans, the Native Americans, believe there are four cycles of ages according to Hindus, and we are in the fourth cycle. They don't have the name for it, but they say the characteristic is exactly the definition of Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga is called the age of hypocrisy, quarrel, and hypocrisy, and they say the same thing. So the Native Americans are like full of wisdom, but the European settlers or the European Americans, origin American or settler Americans who came without a visa, undocumented migrants, that is that will be used for them because they came just on their own with a boat, thinking of man as dominion over matter. Now, these philosophies and Europeans, particularly European philosophies, have only created wealth for the Europe and the West, in the West, which is US, Canada, and everything north up to Europe. So, but the rest of the world is now observing what these guys have done, but they can't act because their money is still parked in the American banks or London banks, financial hub. So, how will the rise of rest of the world will stop this kind of thing?
Mhm. So I believe that the fall of the fiat currency model will be the beginning of, the rural, the native, the indigenous, the traditional, the dharmic, values coming up in the world, and slowly and gradually Asia and Gulf will come out of uh, this 18th century enlightenment, which with which they view the world in a Eurocentric way, that everything Western taken as modern. So slowly and gradually things are going to change, where even the democracy format or the secularism format, all the Western formats are going to be questioned one by one. And this will also include the scientific discoveries and inventions that has happened in the last 150 years. Even those will be challenged, because the natives of the world are going to dig up what their civilizational wisdom was prior to colonialism. So the rest of the world, they are going to recalibrate themselves, going back to that self-employment model, self-sustaining model of living life, uh, out of the clutches of the employer employment relationship, whereby the changes will come in the sense that the manufacturing, the farming, the real production, and along with that, the living standard will not be matched with something which is materialistic, but the living standard would be matched to something which is a social capital kind of a formula, wherein all the Western indexes will also be rejected in terms of whether you call it a per capita income. Now, just take an example of per capita income. Now, why would a country which is operating family unit economics, where the income is consolidated and the expenses per member comes to be the lowest, why would that kind of a country will require a high per capita income? It just makes no sense, right? So all these kind of Western formats and indexes are also going to be questioned and rejected in the new world which is coming up. And this all will have to do a lot with the collapse of the fiat uh, reserve currency status. Now the countries of the world have realized that there is no need of a single country reserve currency, which is going to bring massive macroeconomic changes, not just in terms of valuation of what people generate in their countries and in their daily lives, but also in terms of what countries trade with each other. Somehow there is a realization in the Gulf as well that a lot of their free crude oil wealth got wasted in the radicalization efforts and gimmicks to keep the US dollar going as a reserve currency in the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent. So they are also coming back to the roots of attaching themselves with ancient India, and they want to participate in now the real economics rather than moving towards those tiny corners of radicalized thoughts. So even that society is now evolving. They are also voicing up to Biden not taking Biden's phone calls and whatnot. So I think a lot of the rest of the world is trying to wake America up. They're trying to bring UK and US out of that 18th century colonial mindset, and that is what this decade is going to be.
So dry cleaning is about to begin, huh? According to you.
Yeah.
So one question has come in. So the West spent a lot of money in radicalizing people on religious basis. A lot of money, and you can name it from Shah of Iran to be replaced. And Shah was such a liberal leader.
Liberal guy.
Saddam Hussein was a liberal person. Like the Iraqi women can move freely, and it had Iraq. By the way, most people don't know. Maximum engineers, doctors used to come from Iraq. Very educated people. Syria, very open society, almost like on the French lines, where you can have a French kiss on the street in Syria at one point. But so radicalization was brought in, and the same people started preaching about de-radicalization. And I don't speak about our Indian media. Indian media is most of the Indian media reports the agency viewpoints. And like they are no independent. Majority, 90% of the Indian media is like that. So they're changing in last 10 years, but nothing has happened yet. Now coming to, so there was no second voice for the people. Now, so the radicalization is caused by, so the question which has come from the students is, World Bank, United Nations, World Trade Organization, why are they, what the rest of the world now, India is doing and other people are doing, BRICS is doing, why these changes did not begin from the World Bank? Answer, you know, I know, but they want to hear from you. UN, WTO, and all these international agencies, why didn't this happen, de-dollarization, by them? Because they were controlling the economy.
So all the international bodies that came up after the Second World War, these are basically unipolar dollar-led bodies. And this word you will never find about unipolar dollar-led trade deals or unipolar dollar-led regulations, unipolar dollar-led human rights. Right? This is exactly what has happened after the Second World War, and all these is hidden under the carpet under the name of globalization. Now, there has never been a true and fair globalization, so to speak. What has happened, what the world has seen in the last 150 years, is unipolar dollar-led international trade. It was never globalization. If there had to be some free and fair globalization, it should be free movement of all the four factors of production to and fro. Has it ever happened? No. Right. So when they talk about rules based international order, when these bodies talk about, they are talking about the Western templates of regulations. They are never talking about taking the entire rest of the world along. And what is this? These are the international communities, so to speak: US, UK, Canada, Australia, right? And some countries in the Europe. So the world is realizing this, and as you see that the United Nations Security Council has still not reformed after talks for 30 years, and India has still not been given its due position with the veto power over there. So I think that's the end of the international bodies in terms of influence. I mean, these bodies are now going to be reduced into what I would call in India as a chai pani nashta table kind of a thing, because the other bodies are going to take over all the influential role and task of these bodies, because these bodies failed to reform, failed to read what Asia and Gulf are has undergone in the last 10 to 20 years. Exactly what I said. The rest of the world is trying to bring out US and UK from the 18th century to this century, and US and UK are just dragging their feet, still delusioned of the big chunk of role which they played back then. That cannot happen again. I mean, they have to wake up that this is 21st century. You cannot drag your feet in 18th century and believe that that kind of influence is going to continue moving forward. It cannot.
One last question, and it is little out of the topic. The Ukraine, the West has not moved ahead on the Ukraine Russian war, which is primarily created by the West, by Americans, since 2014, is that since 91 actually, is that Russia has a bigger stockpile of nuclear weapons than the entire West combined, which is primarily UK and US. And all the delivery vehicles also, Russia has more, which they have shown. So all the propaganda the Russian military is weak is busted now, totally busted, and they are doing a much more precision attacks, unlike Americans killed some rickshawalas in Pakistan, you know, like,
True.
and all the American terrorists, I mean, all the terrorists in the Middle East resurface after 6 months, and recently one guy again resurfaced. So they killed the wrong guy in the first place. So, so now Russians are not doing that. Russians are verifying, and they're showing also on videos live. Americans have not shown anything on live so far. So the entire thing is run by the Hollywood industry. Looks like the American administration, Hollywood are closely colluding to create this thing. So the question is, will India ever grow without the protection of ample number of nuclear weapons to protect themselves? Because the pacifist ideology doesn't drive the economy.
So moving forward, what I see happening is next 2 to 3 decades, India, Russia, and China are going to fix and seal their individual spheres of influence. This is what I look at. I mean, if you look at the Indian Ocean, it has always been the main battlefield in the world. I mean, that's a pivot of global economics. That is where it happens. 90% of the raw materials, resources, gas, oil, everything flows from that peaceful ocean. But looking at what's going to happen next, as I see news of Raytheon and then General Electric and then Boeing and then Airbus and then Sundar Pichai being awarded in the West, and then he comes and meets our Prime Minister. Looking at all these changes which are happening, I believe the American some of the chunk of the American deep state companies, along with their technology, I feel will shift and settle in India over this decade. I mean, a lot of not just collaboration and technology transfer, but a lot of real deals and real manufacturing of the deep state technology and stuff is going to begin and happen in India. I mean, by the end of this decade, you will visibly see that big companies and technology has shifted to India. So over the period of time, India is going to regain the hard power which you are asking the question about. So it's not just going to be soft power; it's also going to be hard power. And the traditional Indian subcontinent, with the concept of Akhand Bharat, which we call it, I believe that will extend from Saudi Arabia to Laos, Cambodia, wherein even the Chinese economy, once it starts facing the economic crisis because of the aging population, even they will come to terms with the new changes and the emergence of India back onto the throne, which we have been for over 1700 years, if you consider the last 300 years as some kind of an aberration. So definitely you will see hard power coming out of India as well. It's not just going to be about the soft power.
Viewers, you'll not find this kind of discussion anywhere, because I personally like Ankit, and therefore I'm speaking with the background of my books also and his research as well, because no, he won't be asked these kind of questions in any other channel. Now, one question has come in from the audience, is that the will it happen what India did to UK? They own all their brands, British Gas, British Steel, their premium Jaguar is owned by Indians, and their motorcycles are all Indians, all Indian motorcycles. Only thing one which is left is Bonneville, but I'm sure it will come to Indian fold very soon, and is left there. The same thing is happening in US. Reliance owns most of the shale gas rights. Americans don't even know. They own most of the American shale gas rights are owned by the Reliance Industries of India. And so if you're from Pennsylvania to Texas, is all Reliance. Most of it is Reliance. So it's gradually happening. So will India do the same thing to America which they did to India or to UK?
Well, I believe Aditya ji, this is something which is a very natural phenomenon for for a country which is looking for a role of a Vishwa Guru. I mean, Vishwa Guru is diagonally opposite to what we believe as the word superpower. Superpower is something which the terminology of superpower comes from the Western thought process. The ability of Vishwa Guru is about influencing without firing a bullet across. So I believe that the soft power and hard power will build each other. And if I'm supposed to give you a simple example and not take much time, I know that will be short of time. So a simple example, if I can give, when we see Indians leading top big corporates of the world, be it Europe, be it US. You understand the sinking ladder phenomenon. If you look at that triangle of management hierarchy, the top management is at the top, and then the middle management, and then it goes down to the bottom management. Now, when you transfer a whole level of management hierarchy outside, which is which is what a lot of West did, it transferred the lowest level outsourcing tasks to India and the Indians worldwide. Now, when you transfer a whole level of management hierarchy outside, the immediate problem you are going to face is you're not going to get people for the immediate higher department, because it's somebody has to be a student to become a professor, right? So the next department then starts shifting to India or becomes an Indian, and then the next department, and then the next department, and this is how the entire management hierarchy and the top management becomes an Indian. Now, a lot of news, when this kind of news come to India, there is a negative tinge to the among the people, that hey, see, that fellow is Indian, he's reached to the top, but is he going to do anything about India or not? Now I say, let's put that that perspective aside and just think it this way. If the management hierarchy is Indian, if the final product or the service which is to be generated is going to be consumed by Indians, because we are a big consumer market, if the research for that product or service is going to be happening in some of the Indian mind, then I think, what do you want? I mean, we already become a kind of a Vishwa Guru in terms of the kind of influence that now we can exert without any violence, so to speak, which the Western world predominantly used to colonize the world. So without making the world colony your colony, you can still influence a lot of the world. That's
Yeah.
where this Vishwa Guru concept comes up.
India always historically has an inspirational model, not as a perspiration model, which is used by most of the other people. Uh, one more question has come in, that the American government agencies are known to spy on Americans using these social media platforms, and a lot of things have been revealed by the Twitter expose and Google and other places. We don't know those things. We don't know, but I'm sure it's happening because they were paid by the agencies, which is against the American law, to spy on Americans. Now, will this phenomena be repeated? Because currently Indian CEOs are CEOs of these companies, and it is
Mm.
happening right under their watch. So, what is the guarantee it won't happen if these countries move to India? Probably more Indians will be spied on. Like everybody knows that Facebook is a ultimate platform to be spied on, because everybody's choices are known, how they live their life, who is their family, everything is available on American servers, because
Mhm.
controlled by Americans. Will that continue if Indian influence grows?
Well, once the Indian influence grows and these companies and tech are going to be full on, banking on India, they will have a stake in the Indian economy. Now, a lot of negative usage to this data assets that can be done can certainly be addressed in terms of one, regulations. Second, a lot of these also has to do with what kind of leadership your governance provides. It's not just about the regulation. It's also about the psychological impact of the political leadership that is ruling the country, and the kind of the support the masses give to those leaders. So it will not just trickle down in terms of regulation, but it will also trickle down in terms of social behavior. So whenever India has been in crisis in the recent times, if you look at the COVID era, the kind of leadership which the governance gave, and the reflection which the society reflected back onto the leaders, has been astonishing. So if tomorrow, if there is a government to move to say ban Twitter, or to say, I mean, we have already banned TikTok, right? So this is not something which is unheard, or something which the public is not going to understand. If harsh regulations is something which will be required, those regulations will come, because we aren't that freedom and that hyper freedom kind of a society wherein we will cause inflict harm upon ourselves. So you'll also see the same thing is going on along the lines in terms of cryptocurrencies, the private cryptocurrencies. India is going to be a country which is going to completely ban private cryptocurrency in terms of the legal tender of money usage, as far as that usage of private cryptos is concerned. This is not something there. See, the Hindu family value is going to be of, strategic autonomy, and no country in this world, no company format in this world would be able to ban that particular strategic autonomy feature of the native Indians. That's never going to happen. So when tough steps will be taken, tough steps will be taken. I mean, and all the companies will have to abide by those regulations.
Thank you so much. I know there are a lot of questions coming, but by the way, people did not realize it's almost 1 hour, 10 minutes, almost crossed. And since we went live, and thank you so much. And I know I've been calling him more frequently, but we have to honor his time as well. So for all the viewers who are watching on YouTube, do like, share, subscribe, share, and become a member of Patreon Club, and also YouTube membership, and join our courses, which are very important for understanding the dharmic aspect of Vedic civilization. So namaste and thank you, Ankit.
Thank
Always a
you.
pleasure.
Thank you. Namaskar.